My mother stood on my porch 9 years after telling me I was dead to her for marrying a black man, holding a suitcase and a handwritten list of financial demands. I remember thinking, where was that family 9 years ago, when I was the one who needed help? But to understand how we got to that porch, I need to take you back to the dinner where my father told me to choose between them and the man I loved. I was 23 years old when my father looked across the dinner table and told me that if I married Marcus, I should not expect to be welcomed in his house again. I want to explain, first, who my family was, because I don't think this story makes sense without that context. My parents built a life around a very specific, narrow idea of what our family was supposed to look like. My father ran a mid-sized architecture firm his own father had started. My mother came from old money on her side, the kind of family with a name on a hospital wing 2 towns over. I grew up in a house with a circular driveway, in a neighborhood where, looking back now, I can count on one hand the number of black families who lived there, and every one of them, I now realize, was talked about by my parents in a tone I didn't have the language to identify as a child but understand perfectly now. Marcus and I met in graduate school, in a study group for a statistics course neither of us particularly enjoyed. He was sharp in a way that made the rest of us in that group quietly grateful he was on our side of the whiteboard, and funny in a way that snuck up on you, deadpan, delivered so calmly you sometimes needed a second to catch that he'd made a joke at all. He'd grown up in a working, close-knit black community 2 states over, the son of a nurse and a high school teacher, the first in his family to attend a school like ours on a full scholarship he'd earned through relentless, quiet effort I only came to fully appreciate once I understood how few doors had been opened for him along the way. He told me once, early in our relationship, about the specific calculus he'd learned to run every day of his life, the constant, exhausting recalibration of how he dressed, how he spoke, how quickly he smiled at strangers, depending on which room he was walking into. He described it so plainly, without bitterness, that it took me a full day afterward to understand how much labor was hidden inside that plainness. I'd never had to think about any of that in my own life, not once, and it was the first time I understood, in a way that went beyond abstract sympathy, just how differently the same world had been built around each of us. I fell in love with him slowly, over long nights in the library and even longer phone calls once the semester ended. And then all at once, the way people talk about it in movies but that I never expected to actually happen to me. He made me laugh more than anyone I'd ever dated. He remembered details about my life I didn't think I'd mentioned, the name of a childhood pet, an offhand comment about a fear of heights. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of partner I'd have described years earlier, if someone had asked me to imagine my future. I brought him home to meet my parents about 5 months into dating, naively hopeful, the way you are when you love someone and assume the people who love you will simply see what you see. My mother was polite in the specific, brittle way she reserved for situations she'd already decided were temporary. My father barely looked at Marcus directly during dinner, addressing most of his questions to me instead, as though Marcus were a colleague of mine rather than the person I'd brought home to meet them. I remember the particular quality of that silence, thick and deliberate, the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all but a message being sent without needing words. After Marcus left that night, my mother found me in the kitchen washing dishes and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. She asked me, in a voice pitched carefully between concern and warning, whether I'd really thought through what a life with someone like Marcus would mean, whether I understood the assumptions people would make about our future children, about our future in general, in rooms neither of us would ever fully control. She never said the word. She didn't have to. I remember standing there with soap still on my hands, feeling something in me go cold and clear at the same time, a strange combination I didn't have a name for yet but understand now as the exact moment I stopped expecting her to see what I saw. The comments started almost immediately after that first dinner, delivered in the specific, deniable way my parents had perfected over decades of country club conversations. My mother would mention, almost wistfully, a friend's son who'd just made partner at a law firm, someone from our world, a phrase she used often enough that I eventually understood exactly what world she meant and exactly who was excluded from it. My father, for his part, rarely mentioned Marcus by name at all in the months that followed, referring to him instead as your friend, a small linguistic erasure I noticed building, dinner after dinner, like water finding a crack. I confronted my mother about it directly once, maybe 6 months in, asking her plainly whether her hesitation about Marcus had anything to do with his race. She looked genuinely offended by the question, which I've since learned is its own kind of answer. She told me it had nothing to do with that she's simply worried about the difficulties a couple like us might face, about how people might treat our future children, framing her own prejudice as concern for a world she claimed, without irony, to have no part in shaping. I didn't have the language yet to name exactly what was happening, only a growing, uncomfortable certainty that her concern was a costume for something else entirely. When Marcus proposed, a little over 2 years into our relationship, on a quiet overlook where we used to go to escape the noise of graduate school, I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. I called my mother that same night, still giddy, still holding out some small, stubborn hope that this news might finally soften something in her. Instead, there was a long silence on the phone. And then she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use before, that she needed to discuss this with my father before she could process it. The dinner where my father delivered his ultimatum happened 2 weeks later. He told me, in the same measured voice he used for business negotiations, that marrying Marcus would fundamentally change how our family was perceived, that it would raise questions among people whose opinions, apparently, mattered more to him than my happiness. He never used explicitly racial language, not once, not directly, because men like my father have spent their entire lives learning to say exactly what they mean without ever saying it plainly enough to be held accountable for it. But the meaning was unmistakable. He said that if I went through with the wedding, I should not expect an invitation to Christmas, should not expect financial help if I ever needed it, should not, in his words, expect this family to bail you out of a decision you made with your eyes open. I asked him directly, my hands shaking under the table, whether this was actually about Marcus being black. My father's face went very still, and he told me that framing it that way was unfair to him, that he simply had concerns about compatibility, about shared background, about 100 other euphemisms that all pointed toward the same ugly center. I remember standing up from that table and telling him that I understood exactly what he meant, even if he refused to say it out loud, and that his refusal to say it didn't make it any less true. I married Marcus 8 months later, in a small ceremony with 50 guests, none of whom were my parents. My mother sent a card, no gift, just a card, with a single line inside. I hope you understand what you're giving up. I kept that card for years, not out of sentimentality, but because some part of me needed proof, later, that I hadn't imagined how cold she could be, that the family I'd once known had genuinely chosen this coldness over me. The years that followed were, in some ways, exactly as difficult as my parents had predicted, though I don't think they predicted them out of concern so much as a desire to be proven right. Marcus and I built our life from nothing, financially, without a single cent from either of our families, since his own parents, though warmer toward me than mine had ever been toward him, had modest means of their own. We rented a small apartment for the first 3 years, both of us working long hours, Marcus finishing an engineering degree while working nights, before he eventually took a position at a small tech startup that, at the time, seemed like any of 1,000 ambitious little companies that never quite make it big. But I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for anyone listening who's ever been told that choosing love over approval is a mistake. Those were also, in many ways, the richest years of my life, richest not financially, but in every other sense that actually matters. Marcus and I built something entirely our own, without my parents' money, without their opinions shaping every decision, without the particular exhaustion of trying to make myself smaller so as not to disturb whatever fragile peace my father's approval required. When our son was born 4 years into the marriage, Marcus stayed up with him every night for the first 2 months so I could sleep before an early shift, humming songs his own mother used to sing to him, and I remember thinking, watching them together in the dark, that whatever my parents believed they protected by rejecting him, it was nothing compared to what I'd actually gained. There was one person from my old life who never fully disappeared, and that was my younger brother, David. He'd been a teenager when I got married, still living under our parents' roof, still absorbing their worldview daily in a way I'd already started to unlearn. He didn't come to the wedding, forbidden by our father in a way I understood he was too young to fully resist at the time, but he texted me quietly for years afterward, small check-ins, questions about my son, occasional confessions about how uncomfortable he'd started to feel at family dinners whenever our parents' old assumptions surfaced in casual conversation. It was David who eventually told me, years later, that our father had once described Marcus at a dinner party as an example of how far some people can come, a comment delivered with a smile that made it sound like a compliment to anyone not listening closely enough to hear the assumption buried underneath it. My parents did not meet their grandson for the first 5 years of his life. I sent photos occasionally, more out of habit than hope, updates about milestones I suspected they'd never actually read closely. My mother sent one email back, when my son turned 3, with a single stiff line asking whether Marcus's job was stable, a question so transparently designed to confirm her old assumptions about his adequacy as a provider that I didn't bother responding at all. Marcus's startup, the small ambitious company nobody thought much of in its early years, grew steadily and then suddenly, the way these things sometimes do, cresting into genuine, significant success by our 7th year of marriage. By our 9th year together, the company went public, and the value of Marcus's early equity, the shares he'd taken instead of a higher salary back when we were living paycheck to paycheck, put our combined net worth somewhere in the tens of millions almost overnight. I remember the strange vertigo of that number, how it didn't feel real for months, how Marcus and I mostly kept living exactly as we always had, unable to quite believe the ground had shifted that dramatically beneath us. I didn't hear from my parents again in any meaningful way until 9 years after that ultimatum dinner, 9 years almost to the exact week, which I only realized later, when I looked back at the dates, not long after a business magazine ran a profile on Marcus's company that included, among other details, an approximate figure for our net worth. My mother showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, carrying an actual suitcase, as though she'd already decided, before I'd said a single word, that she'd be staying. In her other hand was a folded piece of paper, a handwritten list, I discovered once she finally sat down at my kitchen table, of specific financial requests. Help covering my father's failing business investments, a contribution toward their mortgage, which had apparently ballooned after a refinancing decision gone wrong. Tuition money for a cousin's children, people I'd never even met. She talked for nearly 20 minutes, working her way toward the actual request with the same circling, uncomfortable momentum she'd used 9 years earlier to work her way toward rejecting Marcus in the first place, as though both conversations required the same careful architecture of avoidance. And then, finally, she said the words that I still think about now. Family helps family. We're still your family, whatever happened before. I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I said anything, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what she was asking. She was asking me, the daughter she'd told to expect nothing from this family should she marry a black man, to now provide exactly the kind of financial support she'd once weaponized as a threat to control my choice of who to love. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, where this concept of family had been 9 years earlier, when Marcus and I were splitting a single car between us and working double shifts to afford a one-bedroom apartment. I asked her where it had been when my son turned 1, 2, 3, 4, and neither of his grandparents had bothered to acknowledge his existence beyond a single transactional email about his father's job stability. My mother's response was to say that things had been different then, that she and my father had genuinely believed I was making a mistake, and that surely, now that things had worked out, we could all move forward. I asked her, directly, whether she still believed what she'd believed 9 years ago, whether she thought Marcus being black had, in fact, made him less capable, less worthy, less suited to provide for a family, given that the outcome she'd once predicted with such certainty had turned out to be the exact opposite of what actually happened. She didn't answer that question. She looked down at her hands instead, and I understood, in that silence, that she still hadn't fully reckoned with what her original objection had actually been, that his eventual success embarrassed her more than it humbled her, because it proved her wrong in a way she couldn't easily explain away. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, considered helping anyway, purely because some deep, stubborn part of me still wanted my mother's approval, even after everything, even after 9 years of proof that her approval had never been unconditional to begin with. But then I thought about every holiday Marcus and I had spent alone in our first years of marriage, every milestone of my son's life my parents had chosen to ignore, every conversation where my father had made it clear, in language careful enough to avoid direct accountability, that Marcus's race made him fundamentally unsuitable in his eyes. And I understood, with a clarity that genuinely surprised me, that helping them now would mean confirming the exact belief that had caused all of it in the first place, that their approval and their needs could simply resume their place in my life the moment it became convenient for them, regardless of what they'd once made me and my family suffer to prove a point. I told my mother, as calmly as I could manage, that I was not going to give her money, not because I couldn't, but because doing so would mean pretending the last 9 years hadn't happened exactly the way they had. I told her that if she wanted any real relationship with me, with Marcus, with her grandson, it would have to start with an actual reckoning, not a suitcase and a handwritten list, delivered the moment our success became too large to ignore. She left angry, angrier, I think, than she'd been on the night of my wedding, because this time the rejection was coming from someone she'd assumed would always eventually cave to family obligation, the same obligation she'd refused to extend to me 9 years earlier. I didn't hear from her for several months after that visit. I want to pause here and talk about Marcus, because I think his response to all of this says something important. When I told him about my mother's visit that evening, expecting him to be angry on my behalf, he was instead quiet for a long time, sitting at our kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and then he said something I've thought about often since. He told me that he understood, more than most people probably could, what it felt like to have your worth measured by people who'd already decided the answer before meeting you, and that he didn't need my parents' belated acknowledgement to know what he'd built or what he was worth. He said the money didn't change any of that. It just made the contradiction between their old certainty and the current reality impossible for anyone, including them, to ignore any longer. I asked him, that same night, whether he wanted any part of a relationship with my parents going forward, given everything they'd put him through, every erasure, every careful euphemism designed to avoid saying plainly what they meant. He thought about it for a long time before answering. He said that he'd spent his entire life building an identity that didn't depend on the approval of people who'd already decided, unfairly, what he was capable of, and that this had never been about earning my parents' respect in the first place. It had always been about whether I was willing to keep choosing him regardless of what they thought. He said the only thing that would genuinely hurt him now would be watching me quietly slide back into old patterns of seeking their approval, the same patterns that had once made me hesitate, if only briefly, before defending him at that first family dinner. David, my brother, reacted differently when I told him about our mother's visit. By then he was in his late 20s, married himself, and had spent years quietly distancing himself from our parents' worldview in ways that had started long before Marcus's company ever went public. He told me he wasn't surprised in the slightest, that he'd watched our mother rehearse a similar recalibration with other relationships over the years, whenever old prejudices became inconvenient in the face of undeniable success. He said watching me hold my ground, this time, was the thing that finally gave him the courage to have an honest conversation with our father about comments he'd let slide for years out of habit and fear of conflict. In the months that followed, I did eventually reach out to my father directly, mostly out of a desire to have one honest conversation before deciding, for good, what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with my parents going forward. It was a difficult, halting conversation. He didn't apologize in the way I'd hoped he might. He acknowledged, in careful, lawyerly language, that he'd been wrong about some things, though he never once said the word race directly, even then, even faced with everything that had happened. I asked him directly whether he could say, plainly, what his original objection to Marcus had actually been. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, before he finally said that he supposed he'd been afraid of what people would assume about our family, an answer that came closer to honesty than anything he'd offered in 9 years, even if it still stopped short of the word itself. I understood, in that conversation, that some people will go to their graves without ever fully naming the thing they need to name, and that waiting for that naming isn't something I owed myself any longer. I didn't give my parents money. What I offered instead, eventually, was a narrow, carefully bounded space for my son to know his grandparents, supervised at first, built slowly around actual demonstrated respect rather than a return to the old arrangement where their approval, and now their need, dictated the terms of my life. It has been slow. My mother still, occasionally, says something that reveals how little has actually shifted beneath the surface. A comment about how far Marcus has come, delivered with a kind of surprise that still carries the old assumption underneath it. I correct her when she does. I don't know if it lands. I've decided that's no longer my responsibility to manage. My parents eventually resolved their financial situation without our help, through a combination of selling a second property they'd held for decades, and I later learned through David, a considerably more modest lifestyle than the one they'd always considered non-negotiable. I don't know exactly how difficult that adjustment was for them, and I've stopped asking, partly because I've realized that my curiosity about their struggle was, for a long time, its own quiet form of waiting for them to finally understand what they cost themselves. I no longer need that understanding from them to feel at peace with the choice I made. Marcus's company continues to grow. I think, sometimes, about the specific irony of my father once dismissing him as unsuitable, using language just careful enough to avoid direct accusation, only to watch that same man build something that outpaced every metric of success my father had ever used to measure his own worth. I don't say that with pure vindictiveness, though I won't pretend there isn't some quiet, complicated satisfaction in it. I say it because I think it's worth remembering if you've ever been told that the person you love isn't enough, that the people doing the telling were never actually measuring worth in the first place. They were measuring their own comfort and calling it concern. My son is 9 now, old enough to ask real questions about why his grandparents weren't around when he was small. I've told him a version of the truth appropriate for his age, that his grandparents once believed something untrue and hurtful about people who look like his father, and that it took them a long time and a great deal of undeniable proof to even begin questioning that belief. He asked me once whether I thought they were sorry. I told him I thought some of them were starting to be, and that the rest of them might never fully get there, and that either way, his wife and his father's worth had never actually depended on their approval to begin with. David's own daughter, my niece, is close in age to my son now, and the two of them have grown up knowing each other in a way that skipped an entire generation of the old family assumptions, something I find quietly hopeful whenever I watch them together. David tells me his raising her deliberately different, naming things plainly in his own household that our parents never had the courage or honesty to name in theirs. I like to think that whatever Marcus and I survived gave him at least part of the language to do that. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. People who dress up prejudice as concern are not protecting you from a difficult life. They are protecting their own comfort, their own image, their own certainty that they already know who deserves what. Real family does not disappear for 9 years, only to reappear with a suitcase the moment your success becomes too large to dismiss. And if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, being asked to extend unconditional generosity to people who once withheld their basic acceptance from you as punishment, know that saying no isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the first honest boundary that finally forces people to see what they refused to see all along.